Jesus, if this is the Son of God, He would have never done it on the Sabbath day. They began to interrogate Him. They even went to His parents. Did you read that? And they asked His parents, is this your child? Is this your son? They said yes. Was he born blind? Yes. How is he able now to see? They said, we don't know. I like what they said. We don't know, but he is of age. Go and ask him. You can ask him. Listen, I had a wonderful father that left us 3 years for glory. My mother's still living, and I thank God for their love and legacy, what they've given to me. But at any time since I've been a Christian, if you wanted to know about my experience with Jesus, you don't really have to go and ask my mom or my daddy. I'm old enough. I was there when it happened. I can tell you what happened. They went to the man that was blind, and they said, are you able now to see? And he said, yes. Said, how did it happen? He said, a man named Jesus touched my eye, and now I can see. They said, you ought to give God the praise. This man, Jesus, is a sinner. And this man, you talk about somebody that doesn't know any theology, he says, well, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. There's only one thing I do know. You know what? Somebody ought to write a song about this. There's one thing I do know. Before he touched me, I was blind, but now I can see. You might not know a verse of Scripture. You might not know any theology or doctrine or be able to articulate a logical sentence, but everybody that's been touched by Him ought to be able to say, before He touched me, I was this way. But now I am this way. He was in darkness. But when Jesus later found him in the temple and said, do you believe on the Son of God? He said, who is He? He said, the one that touched you, the one that's talking to you. He said, I believe. And all of a sudden he was enlightened. Finally, the last sign, the last miracle. John chapter 11. Jesus gets word that his good friend, his dear friend, Lazarus, is sick. And this is a perplexing passage because Jesus does something unusual. He doesn't do anything. He waits, doesn't he? One whole day, 2 whole days go by, and Jesus doesn't go. And finally he gets word Lazarus has died, and he's dead. And Jesus said, now let's go. Now nobody could understand why Jesus did it that way. This is the worst of all. This is worse than disappointment. It's worse than matters of distance. It's worse than having a disability. This is worse. Worse than a dilemma. This is worse than despair. This is worse than being in darkness. This is death that we're talking about. There's nothing worse than when death comes to a home or to a family. Death has come. Jesus said, now let's go. How many of you believe like I do? He could have went immediately and healed him. He didn't even have to go. He could have just spoke the word. He didn't even have to speak the word. He could have given divine indication and Lazarus would have got better. But Jesus waited until he died and then he shows up. And when he does, Martha comes out crying saying, Lord, if you'd have been here, our brother would not have died. Now I ask you, is that a question of faith or doubt? And I think the answer is both. She said, if you'd have been here, you could have done something. That's an indication there was faith, but it's doubt because you can't do anything now. It's too late. But Jesus says to her, your brother's going to live again. She said, I know he'll live at the last day, at the resurrection. But Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. And he that believes on me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. When he talked with Mary, she said the same thing, word for word, when she came out of the room. Lord, if you'd been here, our brother would not have died. Where have you laid him? And they go to the cemetery. And it says there that Jesus wept. I taught him about it a few days ago, and I came to this part, I believe, and I shared with them, you know, to me that those 2 words, Jesus wept, have become so precious. They are not just the shortest verse in the Bible. In many ways, it has to be among the most precious words in the Bible. You know why? Because it shows us of the humanity and the compassion of our living Lord. I had a student that said one time, they said, do you think that Jesus, the reason he cried, it was tears of joy in anticipation of what he was getting ready to do? And I thought about that and I said, no. You know, that sounds to me like we have trouble with a human Jesus sometimes, and we want to just keep him as a cosmic figure that's really not like one of us. I said, no, I really think the reason that Jesus wept, he looked at Mary with tears rolling down her eyes, and he looked at say that Jesus wept. He says that he said something. He said, Lazarus, come forth. In the tomb, then the stone was rolled away, and Lazarus comes out, and then he's loosed and set free. And even death cannot hold its prey in the presence of Jesus, the Son of God. Now all of this happens in the first 11 chapters, and John puts his pen down. He's going to write 10 more chapters. But these are the only miracles the theologians tell us that he included in those first 11 chapters. And John then at the very end says there's many other signs which Jesus did. But these are written that you might believe that He's the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that believing you might have life in His name. And I want to ask you tonight, does anybody really in Piney Grove camp meeting tonight, do you really believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? It's so essential and so important. Life only comes through His name and in belief of this truth. What are these signs? If these are more than miracles, if they're signs, what are they pointing to? They're all pointing to Jesus. And here they are. I've already told them to you. But at the wedding in Cana, Jesus is the answer for your disappointment. Somebody here, you've run out of resources, you've run out of wine at your wedding, you've run out of help, you've run out of hope. That sign is saying Jesus is the answer. That healing of the nobleman's son is saying that Jesus is the answer to the issues related to distance. That raising of the lame man, that disability when he couldn't even help himself. If you don't have the ability to go any further, to do any more, to deal with it any longer, that sign is saying Jesus is the answer for your disability. That multiplication of the loaves and fishes, He's trying to tell us something tonight. Jesus, He's the answer for every dilemma. Some of you sitting here thinking you got a problem nobody can solve. You might give it as an unspoken request, but you wouldn't dare utter it to a general assembly of even believers. But Jesus is the answer for that dilemma. Jesus is the answer for despair. Like on the ship that night, Jesus is the answer. He is the answer for darkness when you can't even see. And He is the ultimate answer over death. And John says, that's enough. And he puts the pen down. Now I submit to you that even though the scholars and theologians say that these were the only signs that John was talking about, I think there were some other signs, other miracles in the book, not included in the 7. And I say tonight in your hearing, the grandest and greatest of all, hanging on the cross in chapter 19, when Jesus, when He who knew no sin is made to be sin for us, so we could be made the righteousness of God in Him. When His death gives freedom and life to us, there is no greater miracle than that, unless it's what happens in chapter 20, when He who was taken down from the cross and His body was buried, suddenly comes forth in resurrection, power and light. Do you understand? That's the greatest sign of all. That's the greatest miracle of all. The resurrection of Jesus. Matter of fact, Jesus said one time, there's no other sign given except that one. Like Jonah in the whale, 3 days and 3 nights. That's the only sign. That's the only sign. Here's the way I am about the resurrection, people. It either happened or it didn't. Do you agree? And if it didn't, I'm out. If I find out tomorrow that the resurrection didn't happen, somebody else will have to preach the rest of the camp meeting. I'm going back to Oklahoma and I'm going to do something else. But if it happened, I'm in. If it didn't happen, if the resurrection didn't happen, then I cannot believe a thing in this book. I can't believe anything it said. But if it did happen, if that really happened, I can believe everything in this book. So I say without hesitation, all